Is the Civil War still being fought in the spirit world around Gettysburg? There are many who say yes. In July of 1863, the greatest battle of the war was fought here. For 3 heart-stopping days, armies of the North and the South poured their very existence into an epic clash that ultimately changed the course of the war. The price for the battle came high, and it was paid for in blood. By the conflict's end, over 50,000 men were listed as killed, wounded, or missing. Over a century has now passed since the guns of war were silenced. Yet persistent sightings around Gettysburg of phantom soldiers has become a routine occurrence. The historic little Pennsylvania village may very well be the most haunted place in America. Writer and historian Mark Nesbitt has spent nearly 2 decades chronicling the phenomena of the ghosts of Gettysburg.
There seems to be a lot more ghostly activity or paranormal activity in Gettysburg for one reason or another. Certainly a concentration of death. People were fighting here not only for their lives, but for a great cause.
No one knows for sure, but it seems the creation of a ghost is the end result of a complex and tragic set of events.
What exactly is a ghost? I think a ghost is some sort of energy source that maybe we haven't been able to define yet. These energy sources seem to come from places or seem to remain in places where some great trauma has occurred, some incredibly large emotional energy has been expended. And of course, the battlefield of Gettysburg is a place where a great deal of emotional energy was expended. Some people call it residue haunting.
A classic Gettysburg ghost story was born out of one of the most bizarre incidents of the entire Civil War.
On the first day's battle, July 1st, 1863, the area called Seminary Ridge was first held by Union troops, then Confederates swept over that area and held it. Of course, Robert E. Lee was the commanding general of the Confederate Army. There were dead soldiers all over the area, and his aides, no doubt, told the other soldiers to clean this area up since the commanding general was going to use this as his headquarters. It was hot. It was July. The first thing that they did is they gathered up all the bodies, and rather than burying them right there in front of Robert E. Lee, what they did is they would put them in basically cold storage.
Nearby, an old barn was found that had a stone floor.
They brought the bodies in. They just piled them up very quickly like cordwood in this cool area so that they wouldn't decompose quite as quickly.
With the great battle raging just outside the walls of the barn, the stacked bodies inside were forgotten for the moment. The rebels were now concentrating their efforts and energy on tasks for the living, rather than caring for the dead. There was just one problem. A mistake had been made. The man had been wounded and was unconscious when picked up off the field, but he was decidedly not dead.
Help me! He, no doubt, was paralyzed partially, and of course, with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of human flesh lying on top of him, he couldn't crawl out. He couldn't remove himself from that hideous situation.
It was the beginning of a waking nightmare.
Perhaps one of the worst nightmares any human being can imagine is being buried alive You can't move. You can't remove yourself from the situation. It's dark. You're trapped. And of course, in his situation, it was even worse because he had human flesh that was decomposing right above him. And of course, you can just imagine the smells and the bodily fluids and the just the sheer horror that this poor individual was experiencing as he lay underneath this pile of rotting human flesh.
The soldiers' cries fell on deaf ears. How could any man's voice be heard above the din of battle and the roar of cannon? Even at night, no one heard his pleas. For 3 days, the battle outside continued. The eyes of the world were focused on Gettysburg, but the ears were directed elsewhere, oblivious to the sound of the entombed man. And then, finally, mercifully, the fighting was over. The defeated Confederate army withdrew from the area. As in all battles, it was up to the victor to bury the dead. Triumphant Federal troops began the grim task of sorting bodies and digging graves. By this time, the young rebel had been under the body pile for 5 hellish days. When the Federals finally stumbled onto the pile in the barn, the soldier had almost no life left in him.
He was finally discovered by Union soldiers and obviously raving, perhaps insane from the frustration and the anger that he felt, and also the horror of the position he had been placed in and was unable to move out of. He died just a few days later.
In the aftermath of the battle, carpenters worked overtime building caskets. But it was soon apparent that the number of dead bodies in Gettysburg far exceeded the Union's ability to give all fallen soldiers a decent burial. Unmarked graves containing dozens of fallen men became the standard operating procedure of the day. In truth, only a few Confederate soldiers received proper burial at all. Perhaps because of the terrifying ordeal he had gone through in the barn, the young soldier, who had been buried alive, was now selected for such an honor. He was laid to rest in a casket just yards away from the old barn where he had spent his last terrifying hours.
Therefore can I lack nothing. You shall feed me in a green pasture. Give me forth.
The ceremony apparently didn't appease his troubled, tortured spirit.
Even in death, you can imagine that he must have been very, very upset and very angry and perhaps even raging after death. Maybe he's caught in that netherland between life and death because of this anger, this unresolved rage that he felt.
Just days after he was buried, the old barn mysteriously burnt down. In its place, on the old stone foundation, a beautiful farmhouse was erected. Over the years, through each passing generation, every owner of the farmhouse reported that an angry, restless spirit dwelt in the basement of the house. It existed in a room located right where the young soldier had suffered and died. The spirit's anger and rage was so intense that it had driven many owners from the building. Even when it wasn't trying to scare people to death, it would play mind games with them.
A couple moved into the house, and right from the beginning, they felt that there was something not quite right, finally culminating in one night of absolute horror when the door to that back room, to that little stone room, was banging and moving. The couple were sound asleep. They heard what the woman described as an explosion down in the cellar. She thought perhaps the furnace had exploded.
Along with the explosion, the spirit also cut the lights off. Being of strong Pennsylvania stock, The couple refused to be held prisoner in their own home by the angry ghost. They decided to go downstairs and confront it. Ghost had used this light trick before to intimidate the owners. The couple wanted an end to the nightmare, but they knew they'd have to appeal to a higher authority if they were going to rid themselves of the angry, tormented spirit.
They called in a priest, and he confirmed that there was a spirit down there and that the spirit was tormented and unhappy and angry, that he had been left in that hideous pile.
Drastic measures were called for. It was decided that the priest would perform an exorcism, not just to bring peace to the house, but hopefully also to the tormented soldier's soul.
The exorcism is a very elaborate ritual using the cross, holy water, the text, a special text, special garments, and he had a desire to help the spirit along, to move the spirit along out of its horrible situation that it had been in for 13 decades. As soon as he got into the room, he detected rage and anger.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Cede this place to Christ.
He wasn't really sure whether he was going to be able to cleanse the house of this angry spirit or perhaps become a victim of it himself. The cleansing took an incredible amount of energy out of the priest.
Luckily, God was with the priest. His voice reached out over a century to the troubled soldier. Finally now, after all these years, the young man would mercifully be released from his burden, and he could finally rest in peace. As the priest left the room, he made one last gesture.
He put the sign of an exorcism, of a cleansing, on the door there. And it still is there today, a circle with a cross inside of it.
Located just inside the boundaries of the Gettysburg National Park is Spangler's Springs. Clearly, this is not one of the main tour destinations for most visitors to the park. Other areas saw much more spectacular action during the battle. Their main claim to fame since the war is because of recurrent sightings here of a ghost that has come to be known as the Woman in White. Legend has it that she is the sad spirit of a young woman who committed suicide at the Springs many years ago after the man she was about to marry broke off the relationship. Most recently, the despondent apparition was sighted by two vacationing nurses. They had heard there were ghosts in Gettysburg, but as veterans of the nursing profession, they approached everything with a high degree of skepticism.
Nursing, at least as far as what I do on one hand, is extremely organized. It's fairly scientific. You have your methods that you go through, and things usually go in steps 1, 2, 3. I'm usually someone who needs a lot of facts.
As darkness descended upon the park, they decided to tempt fate and stay after sundown.
Basically, we were touring the park at night. I like the wildlife. I went out to look for wildlife. We both were joking and talking about ghosts. So we had been making references to, let's pull over here and look and see if we can find anything. This looks like a good spot. I'm gonna cut the lights. We'd been sitting there. It had only seemed like maybe a few moments. I know it was probably a little more than that. It was probably 4 or 5 minutes when I heard this popping sound.
And then an inexplicable chain of events began to unfold.
Do you see that tree there?
Uh-huh.
I noticed on the knoll, the last tree on the right had what appeared to be like a white mist that was rising or coming around the tree. I kind of blinked a few times and I looked around and I looked back. This mist took shape. It took shape in the form of a human female. This person was all in white.
I think at that point it settled in with me that, oh geez, this is something that's really happening. Something did just appear out of thin air, out of the darkness of night, and things like that just don't happen. And at that point I did turn my head.
Although Jennifer looked away, Darla continued to watch, enthralled by the apparition. Neither nurse had ever heard anything about the tragic woman in white at this time, and yet the ghost seemed to communicate to them without words her tale of unbearable, suicidal grief.
That was when the sadness struck. I remember telling Jennifer, oh, she's so beautiful. She is just so beautiful, and it's so sad. And all of a sudden, the tears started running down my face.
You know, Darla, we need to go, and we need to drive out of here now.
By this time, Jennifer had had enough. Although Darla was completely caught up in the haunting, her friend wouldn't stay another second.
The reason I wanted to leave was simply because something had just appeared out of nothing. And that is really foreign to me.
After the incident, many were startled to hear such a wild tale from the two nurses.
I know what I saw. I don't feel challenged by their questions. Really doesn't bother me that they don't believe.
I always thought that I would be so compelled to somehow make them believe what I've seen, and it's really not important to me. I know what I saw. It was very vivid, and that's all I needed to know.
Along with Mark Nesbitt, another longtime observer of the ghosts of Gettysburg phenomena is Dr. Charles Emmons of the Anthropology and Sociology departments at Gettysburg College.
The world of the ghost. This is a very interesting question. I'm inclined to think that they go about a fairly active kind of life, if you want to call it that, and then just part of the time they intersect with us. So that I think we're inclined to imagine that ghosts are only active in one little period of time when we see them. But it seems more likely, more logical to me that they're going through a lot of activity, and then just once in a while, our times or our space-time intersect, and that's when we observe them.
The sighting of a ghost is an extremely rare occurrence. Most witnesses of poltergeist activity describe the experience as almost an accident, something the ghost never intended in the first place.
A lot of times they're not paying very much attention to you. They seem kind of spacey, or a so-called dumb ghost, as opposed to a smart ghost, which is going to interact with you.
There are so many things we'd like to know about them. Do they have feelings? Do they enjoy themselves when we're not watching, when we are not tapped into their world, when we can't see them? Do they have enemies? Do they have friends? Do they love? We know probably that they have a sense of humor, at least the poltergeists or the mischievous ghosts that we have experienced. Or maybe they don't exist at all. Maybe they're just figments of our imaginations. We know for sure one thing, and that's that they're totally unpredictable.
In the summer of 1992, Hollywood came to town to film the major motion picture Gettysburg. Whenever possible, the producers tried to stage scenes on the historic battleground in exactly the same places where the real action had taken place in 1863. They may have unintentionally disturbed the spirit world in the process.
It appears that whenever the physical status quo of an area, the historic area, is upset, there seems to be a lot more psychic activity that occurs. In other words, it seems as if the spirits or the ghosts don't like their routine upset.
After each day of filming, local people provided a shuttle service back into town for the thousands of reenactors who were participating in the battle scenes.
One woman was offering the services of her pickup truck to take some reenactors into the town of Gettysburg. And she dropped off a truckload of reenactors at one of the local restaurants and turned around, and she began driving back home.
It seems she had shuttled more off the battlefield than a bunch of movie reenactors.
She suddenly started to hear a tapping in the back of the truck. She looked in the rearview mirror, and she saw something that completely frightened her. Two Civil War soldiers were sitting in the bed of the truck. Was someone playing a practical joke on her? Had some of the reenactors not gotten out of the back of her truck when she had stopped? Certainly no one had gotten in. She was traveling way too fast once she left the restaurant for anyone to have climbed or jumped into the back of the truck.
How could it be a ghost? But that does happen, that people have a haunting contaminate them, so to speak, and they end up with the ghost somewhere else. Just as some people have moved out of a house and found that the ghosts have followed them.
She pulled over suddenly, leapt out of the cab, went to the rear of the truck, and no one was in the back of the truck. And one can only speculate on who these weary soldiers were, trying to catch a ride on this strange, horseless conveyance.
Whether playing with your mind or just being mischievous and silly, nearly every human activity has been attributed to ghosts. This trickster element in ghostly behavior may also be responsible for numerous unexplained equipment breakdowns on the Gettysburg battlefield.
Countless people have had problems with cameras out in the triangular field area. I myself and two others, simultaneously our cameras broke down in that area. Other people have come up to me when I was out there giving tours and mentioned that all of a sudden their cameras have gone on the blink and they won't function anymore. They tell me when they get out of the triangular field area that the cameras are working fine again.
I think one of the most fascinating questions about ghosts is why there are so many equipment failures. I've had it happen to me. Cameras fail, and I can't remember anything like that happening except when I was doing something on the paranormal, especially ghosts. If there's some sort of psychic energy in a place that accounts for hauntings, then possibly that energy arrangement has something to do with equipment failures too.
One incident actually happened during the filming of Mark Nesbitt at the Triangular Field several years ago by veteran television producer John Jones. Mark warned the producer ahead of time that he was asking for trouble by trying to shoot the story in this haunted place.
goes, no. He said, your cameras won't function in this field. Well, that was a cute story. That's fine. But, we're producers. We're in the real world. And yeah, my cameras will work. They were good cameras. It was new equipment. We had been shooting for a couple weeks up to this time. We asked Mark to step beyond the fence, and we set up our camera. And I was talking to Mark while the crew was setting the cameraman was setting up the camera, and he yelled, John, we've got a problem. And I looked, and he says, I've got a warning light in my viewfinder. I had looked over the fence towards Mark, and he's standing there with this all-knowing smile and shaking his head. I told you so. We hadn't experienced problems with it prior to this event. And we were shooting all morning until we arrived at the triangular field. But the moment we mounted that camera on the tripod and turned the switch on, until we left and lifted the camera off the tripod, we had all kinds of havoc. The camera worked fine the rest of the day. It's only at the triangular field that we have problems making any recordings.
Not all cameras malfunction at the triangular field, but the high number of out-of-focus shots and equipment failures produced there remains a mystery. One Gettysburg residence that is a top candidate for ghostly activity is the Kodori House. During the battle, it was in the middle of it all.
Pickett's charge, if you want to think of a focal point of the American Civil War, you may very well think that it could be the Kodori House. Situated right in the center of where Pickett's men advanced, it must be a funnel of some kind for psychic energies. How many men with hopes high passed that area going towards the Union lines, and just a few minutes later, with their hopes shattered, passed wounded or suffering going back the other way.
Over the years, the old house has been used as a residence for various park officials. During one haunting, it was the home of a park superintendent.
One night, the superintendent's daughter was out there by herself. Her father and mother had gone into town on one of the many social occasions superintendents are invited to. She was alone in the cellar, which had been fixed up as sort of a rec room. All of a sudden, she heard footsteps across the floor above her head.
At first, she thought maybe her parents had come home, but she hadn't heard them drive in.
Mom? Dad?
Suddenly, she realized it wasn't her parents, so it must have been an intruder. And of course, the Kodori house is out in the middle of nowhere and far from the local police or the ranger station. So she was frightened. She felt it was an intruder, and she would have to get to the phone somehow, which was on the first floor. The footsteps continued over her head, and then finally she heard the footsteps begin to go up to the second floor and realized this was perhaps her chance to go up to the telephone. She got up to the first floor, picked up the phone, called the ranger office. And as she's talking to them, she hears the footsteps going across the floor, upstairs, walking all around, looking, seeking something. Finally, the footsteps began coming down the stairs. So she quickly wrapped up her conversation, hung up the phone, ran back down the stairs. It seemed like an eternity while the footsteps above her head, the intruder kept wandering back and forth into the kitchen, into the dining room, back out into the living room. Finally, she heard the footsteps slowly crossing the floor, approaching the door to the basement, and was getting more and more frightened, of course, because it was only a matter of time before he reached the place where she was hiding, in essence, and the intruder would come down the stairs, and she would have to confront him. She was so intent on listening to the footsteps coming closer and closer and closer to the stairs, to the basement where she was hiding, that she apparently didn't hear the ranger vehicle drive up.
Annie?
It was the chief ranger answering her distress call.
Here, what's going on?
Of course, he had placed his rangers outside the building, which is standard procedure. And they came in and explained to her that no one had come out through any of the windows. Thorough search of the house showed no one in the house anywhere. And of course, she was then very confused as to just exactly what it may have been that was walking around through the Kadori house. If there's an explanation for this, it could be possibly that there are some spirits left over from that great emotional trauma that we know is Pickett's charge.
The young are not the only ones affected by ghosts, and their sightings are not just a modern phenomena. One ghost appearance happened just years after the war and occurred to the oldest soldier to fight in the battle, Gettysburg's legendary old warrior, John Burns.
John Burns was sort of a cantankerous elderly gentleman, very active. He was constable in the town of Gettysburg at one point in his life, and he also served as an officer of the court.
With the commencement of the battle on July 1st, 1863, Burns was determined to enter the fray. In retrospect, the opportunity to go to war fit his personality perfectly, for he wasn't one to back down from trouble, and he was also a super patriot. Nearly everything about him was antiquated. The rifle he carried was an out-of-date flintlock, possibly left over from the War of 1812. His clothes were equally out of style. Although surprised by his age, federal troops accepted him, and he marched into battle. As a younger man, Burns had already had some military experience, so he fell right in with the ranks, although some of the men taunted him because of his age.
He gets taunted by the Union soldiers. Oh, you know, in essence, something like, "Oh, go home, old man, you're going to get hurt out here."
Once in battle, though, he seemed to have gained the respect of the younger men. By the afternoon's end, he had received at least 3 and maybe more gunshot wounds from the Confederate enemy. The last shot took him out of the battle.
He was carried back to his house, nursed back to health. He was written up by every reporter who could taste a good story. And he did become, in a sense, a national sensation. I don't have any belief in any supernatural medium at all. But several years after the war, Burns, then about 75 years old, found himself one summer evening walking along the area of the McPherson farm. He said it was in the wooded area. He said as he walked through the woods, he was stopped by a Confederate soldier dressed in gray with a rifle. Now, Burns was a superstitious man. He said as soon as he saw the soldier, he turned and walked out of the woods rapidly. And he said he never went back to that part of the field again. Now, I always found that to be an interesting thought. The idea that someone who could face bullets, artillery, people trying to kill you, but yet was afraid to walk out in the woods at night. As soon as he saw something that, or thought he saw something that wasn't of this world, he said he walked away fast and wouldn't approach it.
Some claim Gettysburg's Eisenhower Farm is another historic site visited by ghostly apparitions.
Of course, 2 presidents are associated with Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln and Dwight Eisenhower. And of course, Lincoln only stayed here one night. But Dwight Eisenhower, decided to make this his home. When he finally purchased the farm here in Gettysburg, they realized as they were renovating that beneath everything was at least a 200-year-old farmhouse that had been there. Various people who've worked out at the Eisenhower farm, from employees, from the Park Service to Secret Service people, have related sounds, the auditory experiences of that are unexplained. There's also the smell, an olfactory experience, the smell of some of the perfume, some of Mamie's favorite perfume that wafts down the hallway and down the stairway. And when they go to examine the perfume bottles, of course, no one's touched the perfume bottles, no one's opened one, none of them have spilled.
An employee of the Eisenhower house described her experiences while working there alone.
There is a wooden barrier at the dining room doorway that would prevent anyone from walking into that room directly, yet it allows people visual access to that area. I was standing at the top of the stairs by myself, and I heard somebody walk from the living room across the foyer into the dining room, and it attracted my attention to the point where I followed the sound with my eyes, and the sound continued through the dining room just as if the barricade wasn't there. The other thing that I experienced in the house was one evening I was in there by myself, and I was on the sun porch, and all of a sudden I heard a bell ringing, like a handbell that was coming from the butler's pantry. There's a handbell that sits on top of a refrigerator in the butler's pantry. And I picked that bell up and I rang it. The sound that I heard when I rang it, even though that was the same sound, it was different. The sound that I had heard earlier was as if it was in, dare I say it, another dimension.
It's like looking into a Viewmaster, but I have to close.
In an attempt to learn even more about the ghosts of Gettysburg, Mark Nesbitt brought noted psychic Carol Kirkpatrick to town to see if she could use her powers to look back into time at the battle and those who fought it.
Of horses and men, and I've been down.
She indeed has a special gift. She has helped a number of law enforcement agencies all over the country to come up with leads, clues to what they have written off as unsolvable mysteries.
One ghost mystery they wanted to get to the bottom of was that of an apparition sighted in the home of Joe and Colette Hood.
We moved in our house in September, 17 years ago, when in October, I was home basically during the day. It's an old farmhouse. And when I would walk from the one room to the other, I would spot this image at the top of the steps going across from room to room. And I would look up and see her, and I think, oh, well, I didn't see that. And I'd just go on about my business. Didn't say anything to anybody for, I guess, over a year.
But the ghost continued to haunt her. Finally, she told her husband.
She didn't say that she was afraid of it at any time, because I'd asked her that. And I did not feel afraid in the house. The house is a very warm feeling house, very comfortable, you know, even if there was something in there. I can't say that the house is a scary type of house.
The Hood house is near Spangler Springs. At one time, they theorized that their ghost might be the famous woman in white.
We'd heard about the lady at Spangler Springs in white and thought perhaps that the lady at Spangler Springs was the lady that this was she that lived in our house, because we have handwritten deeds that go back to 1833 that says these were owned by Spangler at one time.
Carol Kirkpatrick was brought in to give her read on the situation. She almost immediately picked up on part of the past history of the house. The Hoods already knew this part of the story and verified it.
It was
a hospital during the Civil War. I do know that the Confederates had the house the first day of the battle. The second day, the Union came in, chased them across the road, and held the house 17 days after.
The psychic soon zeroed in on what might be the mystery apparition's identity.
She told us that the lady that is in our home is a nurse, and she was a nun, and we figure she came from Emmitsburg, Maryland, because there was a nun and a priest there, and their presence were felt extremely in the one front room upstairs, and say I see her go from room to room, so she would have been nursing the soldiers.
Carol also revealed that the ghost was not the woman in white from Spangler Springs. In fact, the apparition seemed to resent the comparison.
Carol said that the apparition in our house didn't like being identified as the lady in white from Spangler Springs simply because she is a nun and she would be a pure lady, where the lady at Spangler Springs evidently is a fallen type of woman because she must have been meeting a married man over at the Springs.
Immediately after I found it was a nun in the house and I went back into my background, the crosses went up on the wall. That was it. I'm not taking any chances.
Another tragic war story that may have given birth to a ghost involves General John Reynolds. Reynolds was considered by many to be one of the best and brightest officers in the Union Army. During the Battle of Gettysburg, though, the action he saw was short and deadly.
He rode into battle leading his troops about 10 o'clock in the morning of July 1st. By 10:20, he was dead, shot through the head by a Confederate sharpshooter. Reynolds became the highest-ranking Union officer to die in the battle.
Yet his presence has been felt in Gettysburg ever since the war. Perhaps his quick demise so early in the battle has been troubling him over the decades, for his spirit seems to haunt the town. One person he seems to have contacted is Carol Kirkpatrick. The incident happened during a tour of the battlefield, where she didn't know what to expect and had never heard of the general.
No one knew where we were going on the battlefield except for me. I just led them out to these places. And one of the places I wanted to take Carol was to where General John F. Reynolds was shot and killed out at Reynolds Woods. We were driving along Confederate Avenue, and all of a sudden she said, "Ouch, I have a terrible pain in my back."
It's like all the hair started standing up on the back of my head. And then as we went on, it's like the pain started going down my side, my back, my lower back got the pain, then into my leg.
I finally realized that she was talking about General Reynolds. Reynolds was shot in the back of the neck. And of course, that would produce terrible pain down your spine if that had happened.
Soon they stopped in the very area where Reynolds had been shot. Mark was careful not to tell her anything about the general. It was up to her to tell him.
I'd like to get into the person, possibly what his last feelings, activities were, what was going on at the moment he was struck, what was his last concept or factor of happening.
We were walking toward the spot where Reynolds was shot, and it was almost like reading the account from Reynolds' staff member who was right on the spot.
I feel that he was a very strong, outgoing individual, had a strong mind on ideas, factors, very calculating.
She told me that Reynolds was feeling very, very powerful at the time. Of course, he had just been offered the command of the entire Union Army, turned it down, instead was commanding the famous Union Army First Corps.
Was he setting up high when this happened?
He was on his horse. She said he turned, and she indicated the exact direction in which he turned, and she said, and then he was shot.
Amazingly then, Carol saw the death of the great general who had fallen over a century before.
something hit him, and I felt, had he have stayed where he was, it would have possibly hit him in another area. But he was like riding around, it appeared to me, or what's shown to me. And as he rode and turned was when then he was struck.
Carol, you almost said it verbatim exactly what happened to Reynolds. I don't think Carol could have boned up on the battle. I've been studying it for 35 years, and I'm still learning things about it. Certainly she couldn't, in one evening, she couldn't have learned everything that she told me today. So it's virtually impossible for her to have known anything that she wasn't told out on the battlefield.
Sightings of the ghost of General Reynolds in town have been even spookier. After his death, his body was taken to a private residence with the odd name of the George House.
The George House, kind of an unusual name. The man's first name was George, his last name was George, but that is the name of the individual who owned it at the time of the battle. And most of the houses that are historic here in Gettysburg bear the name of the individual who lived there or owned it at the time.
The general's body was later removed to his home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he received a hero's funeral. Today, the George House is a museum and photography store.
Late one evening, after some tourists, there was an adult man and his adult daughter were window shopping at night. They had just been to a restaurant, and it was fairly late, and they were going through the town and looking in different windows. They came to this building and were looking in the windows, and they noticed what appeared to be a wax museum display inside this building. There was a man lying on a bed and a woman sitting beside the bed as if watching over him. The room was very stark.
The man had a beard like John Reynolds and was dressed in a general's uniform. This strange display was not the kind one easily forgets.
Let's go. The tourists were a little confused about this particular display of a dead body and a woman in mourning. They thought it was rather bad taste for a museum to display this type of thing. And so they determined to come back the next day and find out what exactly this display was.
The following morning, the man and his daughter rushed back to the George House.
When they came back the next day, it was a whole different store. The empty room, which was fairly empty except for the wax figures and a few small articles of furniture, were completely gone, and almost every square inch of the store was filled with merchandise. They were really taken aback by this. They talked to the store owners, and they were trying to describe the scene that they had witnessed.
In the vision they had seen the night before, one of them remembered an open doorway behind the fallen general that was now covered up with pegboard. They startled the saleswomen with this revelation.
Of course, you couldn't see a door, but if the pegboard is removed, there is definitely a door there. And this was sort of, to them, was the key to the fact that something really strange had happened, because there's no way for them to know about the door when it was all covered up.
Had the tourists glimpsed a scene from a century past?
It seems that ghosts appear sometimes through an opening, a rip in time, if you will. And this apparently is what these people saw. As they looked through that window, they actually saw back in time, through that tear in time, and saw Reynolds, who was once there, and this woman who was in mourning over his body.
The Lutheran Seminary of Gettysburg is one of the town's landmarks. Established long before the war in 1826, it was well known to many of the soldiers who came to Gettysburg to fight. General Reynolds is said to have visited the school grounds prior to going into battle. Still vital today, the seminary attracts some of the top theological students in the country, including Roscoe Barnes III. It also has legends of ghost sightings. Prior to his own poltergeist encounter in 1992, Roscoe most definitely did not believe in ghosts.
As a Christian, I have certain views about the dead and what happens with the dead. I thought some people are given to that and they see what they want to see. The imagination is very powerful. And I felt that because of stories circulating in the area, well, the students were seeing what they pretty much wanted to see. That was my opinion. But of course, it all changed.
During a night in February of 1992, Roscoe was going through his usual routine. The study load at the seminary is demanding, and he was up late as usual hitting the books. Finally, he decided to go to bed. In the middle of the night, he was startled awake.
Sometime between 2 and 3, I heard a friend down the hall scream. At first, I thought he was playing another one of his jokes. And because he had been in the military, I thought he was making one of his Army calls. And I thought just for a second that maybe there's a problem. But again, I thought military, and I didn't think much of it. About 2 hours later, I was awakened by a very strange presence in the room. I was sleeping on my right side facing the window, and I just had the feeling that someone was standing in the room looking at me. You know, sometimes you can sense those things. Given my background as a Christian and Pentecostal, I felt the presence was something evil. I immediately thought there was a demonic, satanic presence in the room. I turned my head over slightly toward the left to look at this presence. I had no idea what it was or what it looked like, but I looked over there, and when I looked, I saw what appeared to be a man who appeared to be tall. I had the feeling that he was looking through me. And I quickly turned to my right. And for a second, I asked myself, am I dreaming? Am I awake? Is it real? And so I looked again the second time. He was in the same position, standing, looking the same way. So I turned back to the right and began to pray, asking God to help me, calling on the name of Christ, pleading for his help, because I was scared to death. It was frightening. I looked over the third time with more confidence, more courage, with more hope that something was going to happen. He was standing there still on the third time, and then I turned my head and continued to pray. Lord, help me. Lord, help me. These prayers were all without any lip movement. They're all within my mind. I was afraid to move or to show much motion. I didn't know what would happen. But in my mind, I prayed that way. And then when I turned the fourth time, he was gone. And was I elated.
Shaken by the experience, but fortified by his faith, Roscoe decided to let the incident pass. Several days later, however, he happened to meet his friend, the one who lived down the hallway, and who he had heard scream on the same night he'd seen the ghost. Their long conversation covered many topics.
Somehow we ended up on the subject of dreams and demons. And that's when the subject came up, fear. He said, well, man, just the other night something happened to me, and it just really, it just scared the heck out of me.
Evidently, at almost the same time, the apparition Roscoe had seen had also visited his friend. Unlike the officer standing in Roscoe's room, though, for this haunting, the ghost chose only to show his head floating around the room.
Ah! 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 Ah!
At the time, I thought we described it as a dream. But then we thought, this is too coincidental. I mean, there's got to be more to it than just a dream.
Is the Civil War still being fought in the spirit world around Gettysburg? No one can say for sure, but there are hundreds of eyewitnesses who will tell you yes. Experience 2 centuries of distinctive hospitality at Gettysburg's premier address, the Gettysburg Hotel, established 1797. For nearly 200 years, the Gettysburg Hotel has offered a proud tradition of gracious accommodations and fine dining in the heart of Gettysburg. Let the attentive staff of the Gettysburg Hotel make your visit to historic Gettysburg a memorable one. For information and reservations, call 717-337-2000.
ha ha!